Hello, this is Tom Wright speaking from Oxford. I want to share with you some moments from my quite early life when I found myself suddenly struck and indeed in some cases overwhelmed by fresh insights into Scripture, which have shaped a great deal of what I've done ever since, but all of which were quite unexpected when they happened and quite exciting actually. The first one, which I remember as if it was last week, was when I was in my first term as a student in Oxford in 1968, hearing lectures by the late great Professor Henry Chadwick in Christchurch, right in the middle of Oxford. And in one of those lectures, he was talking in general about Christian theology. In one of those lectures, he was discussing the Transfiguration, the time when, in Matthew 17 and parallels, Jesus meets Moses and Elijah on a mountain with the disciples, Peter, James, and John, looking on, sleepy and awestruck, etc. And Henry Chadwick just said, almost casually, after all, for both Moses and Elijah, this was not the first time that they had met God on a mountain. And I remember suddenly seeing a whole swathe of biblical thought and the movement from Old Testament to New and the great story of God going back to Moses on Sinai and then Elijah and Mount Horeb and then coming forward, and now here was Jesus, and then where was all this going to go? And I remember at the end of that lecture coming out, and it was a sunny autumn day in the middle of Oxford, and the sun was shining and the sky was blue, and the whole of Oxford, and especially that college, just looked different. It was as though I was seeing the whole world through different spectacles because of this sudden sense of the continuity of the great sweep of God's story. And that sense of moving from one part of God's story to another and seeing how they fitted together stayed with me through a variety of experiences. One of the very first sermons that I was asked to preach when I was still a seminarian in 1972 at Wycliffe Hall just up the road here was in St Ebb's Church in Oxford on Trinity Sunday, which was a great privilege and quite scary. And the text was Isaiah 6. Isaiah 6, very well-known reading for Trinity Sunday, when Isaiah in the temple sees the angels serenading God and singing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And then Isaiah is scared and says, "Woe is me, what's going to happen?" And the angel comes and touches his lips with a hot coal and says, "Actually, your iniquity is taken away." And then there's a voice saying, "Who shall I send and who will go for us?" And Isaiah says, "Here am I, send me." Now, normally on Trinity Sunday, and I already knew this because of growing up going to church, that reading would stop at that point. Here am I, send me. Cue a nice sermon on vocation, on glimpsing God and then being called to his service. But as I was studying that passage with a view to preaching that sermon, I was struck by the fact that the very next verses, where God says to Isaiah, "Go and say to this people, look and look but never see, and hear but never understand," that very dark and troubling passage, that's the bit which is quoted in the New Testament, and not just somewhere in the New Testament, but by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts, and referred to in Romans as well. So I went back to Isaiah 6 and thought, oh my goodness, there's something more going on here, and we really need the whole story, because Isaiah's vocation, which is given to him with this vision of the angels and of God himself, it makes him feel totally inadequate and sinful, but then there is a word of forgiveness. But that's because Isaiah has to preach a word to the people which says, you are in such bad shape that God's only word to you is judgment, and the judgment will be that you won't be able to see or hear anything. You'll just be blind to the prophetic word. But that isn't the end of the story, because Isaiah then describes how the people are going to be like a tree which is cut down. The last verses of Isaiah 6 give this image of a tree being hacked down and cut back, and then finally the stump in the ground even is burnt. But then the very last line of Isaiah 6 says, "The holy seed is its stump." And that looks forward to all the later prophecies of Isaiah, in which we find that even after this devastating judgment, there is a holy seed. There will come forth a shoot out of the stem of Jesse, and the branch shall grow out of his roots, and so on. And this image of judgment, but then the promise of the seed. As I pondered that, I remember being struck and very excited, because, of course, the passage where Jesus quotes those lines from Isaiah chapter 6 is in the explanation of his first great parable in Mark 4 and parallels, which is about the seed which is the seed of hope, the seed which is about God planting the kingdom. And so suddenly again, as with that aha moment of the Transfiguration, it crept up on me. There's a larger story going on here, and it's not just a one-dimensional sermon about a vision of God and then a vocation. That's all there. You don't lose any of that. It's about something much darker and deeper, which goes forward and includes the whole gospel message, the whole message of and the message about Jesus himself, as he preached about the seed which looked to be going to waste, but then some seed fell on good soil and bore fruit 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold, so that that whole sense of vocation came right forward off the prophetic page into the Gospels and then out into our lives as we were sitting there in a church in Oxford 50 plus years ago now. And so, continuing with that chronological sequence, the next insight which I got, which really has shaped a whole lot of what I've done, again, it crept up on me unawares. I was working on the Old Testament set texts for the theology degree I was doing, and somebody had told me that there was a wonderful commentary on Genesis by one of the great Jewish scholars of the last generation, Umberto Cassuto. And so I was intrigued by this. I'd never read a Jewish commentary on the Bible before, and so I read Cassuto on Genesis. And there are many, many insights there, because he was steeped in the rabbinic learning, which made connections and saw how all sorts of things worked that the rest of us mightn't see. And for me, the key insight was this, that when God calls Abraham and gives him his marching orders, leave your country and your father's house and go to the land which I'll show you, and I will bless you and make you a blessing, and all the nations will bless themselves because of you. And the way that God is calling Abraham echoes the commands that God had given to Adam in Genesis 1. In Genesis 1, God says to Adam, "Be fruitful and multiply, and look after this garden." And in Genesis 12 and subsequently, God says to Abraham, "I will make you fruitful. I will multiply you exceedingly. And here is this land, which is yours for possession." But as I came to see gradually, bit by bit over the years, the land is itself an image for God's claim on the whole creation, which indeed is already promised to Abraham. "In you and your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And so that connection between Adam and Abraham, I started to ponder it and had this strange sense of the divine purpose calling Abraham and his family to undo and reverse the sin of Adam and its effects. So not only was I now reading Genesis differently, here's chapters 3 to 11 with it all going wrong, and then God comes in and does the really unlikely thing in chapter 12, that when God is going to create a new family and a new world, he calls a childless nomad. That sense of the almost laughable grace of God has stayed with me ever since. And it produces, of course, enormous gratitude, but also enormous excitement, because the whole of the rest of the Bible is the story of how that plays out. Because, of course, it isn't a success story. It isn't Abraham saying, "Okay, I've got that, we'll go off and do that." Because chapter by chapter, Abraham both gets it right and gets it wrong. He believes God and it's reckoned to him as righteousness, and then he goes and takes his wife's maid instead of his wife, and so has Ishmael, and that causes all sorts of problems, and so on and so on. Abraham is an up and down character. He's not just a great hero striding through the world as an example to follow. Indeed, anything but. And so I came to see from that original heartwarming moment of realization that actually so much of the Old Testament is the story of what happens when the Creator God says, I'm not giving up on my purpose for creation. I'm not giving up on my purpose for humanity, even though humanity have messed up and spoiled creation as a result. I'm going to choose a human family through whom I will rescue the creation, recognizing that that human family are themselves part of the problem. And so much of the Old Testament is to do with the fact that the people of God, Abraham's seed, are part of the problem and the bearers of the solution. And the prophets constantly have to remind them of both of those. And so ever since that moment of insight, I've been grateful for that sense of the great biblical continuity going from Old to New Testament, as indeed all these examples are like that. So then the next thing was when I was doing doctoral work, and we're talking about maybe 1976 now. Those of you who know anything about the study of St. Paul will know that in 1977, it was nearly 50 years ago now, my goodness, a man called Ed Sanders wrote a book called Paul and Palestinian Judaism, which changed the face of Pauline studies really forever. And so much has been different since then. Even though I have lots of serious disagreements with Sanders, he paved the way. But there was something which had already occurred to me, because in my early doctoral work in 74, 75, that one of the things that really bothered me was that I couldn't quite fit Romans and Galatians together. Now, Romans and Galatians are very similar. They use similar arguments, similar lines, but there are passages which just didn't quite fit according to the interpretation of Romans and Galatians, with which I had grown up and with which we were all familiar, that these were all about how we get justified, not by our moral good works, but simply by believing the gospel. And that went with an idea of Paul's critique of his own contemporaries, his fellow Judeans, the people of Israel in his time, and the traditional view was that Paul's critique was that they were self-righteous. They were trying to make themselves good enough for God by doing moral good deeds. And then one day, as I was bumping my head for the umpteenth time on the Greek text of Romans chapter 10, I came upon and read differently the passage which I've now translated like this. This is verse 3. That the Judeans were ignorant of God's covenant faithfulness, and they were trying to establish a covenant status of their own, so they didn't submit to God's faithfulness. This relies, of course, on translating the Greek word dikaizune as covenant faithfulness or something like that. The old translation was they're ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own righteousness. But suddenly I realized that actually the righteousness here is not a moral righteousness. It's a status of covenant membership, which would be for Judeans and Judeans only. And Paul's whole point is that through the gospel, Gentiles are now welcomed into the family. That's part of the whole point, that in the gospel there is forgiveness of sins. The problem with Gentiles is that they're idolaters and so they're sinners. And Paul says, no, in the gospel, when a Gentile believes the gospel, their sins are forgiven and they are now part of the same family. That, for me, was one of the most profound insights in my early research work. And as I say, it preceded all the study which Sanders and the others were doing, but it meant that from then on, I had a way to read Romans and Galatians which actually fitted together. And so again, this is all about how I was learning to read the whole Bible as a whole and to see how the great themes of the Old Testament were coming forward into the New. And in a sense, I've been doing that ever since. One more little flash. And that was in 1986. My family and I came back from the years we'd spent in Montreal, and one of the new books which had just landed on my desk was a little commentary on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'd been studying the scrolls as best I could. There wasn't much literature on them at that stage, but this was a very helpful little commentary. And at one point, quite casually, the author of that commentary says that the people who wrote the scrolls, like most Judeans of the Second Temple period, did not think that the exile was really over yet. Oh my goodness! Again, I remember exactly where I was in that sense of awe, that instead of the exile and the return from exile just being miscellaneous events in Israel's history, these were, as Matthew sees at the beginning of his gospel, pivotal points, because though they had come back, or some of them had come back, from exile in Babylon, things were still not right. And all those great prophecies from Isaiah and Zechariah and Malachi about how God was finally going to put things right after the exile, they go forward, and the New Testament writers say they are the things which are fulfilled in Jesus and by the Spirit. There's a sense in which I've been exploring the meaning of that ever since. The subtext of all of this is that if you kind of hang out with the Bible, if you say your prayers and adhere to the text and puzzle away and knuckle your brow and try out different sequences and discuss in seminars and so on, you never know when fresh insight is going to sneak up on you from the side, somewhere where you weren't quite expecting. Nor do you know ahead of time that sense of awe and excitement, a sense of being privileged to glimpse something of how the Creator God, the covenant God, had worked in the past, did work in Jesus, is working by the Spirit, and will work in the ultimate new creation.